Say yes, man.
Everyone able to find a seat? Do we need to, we have more chairs if anyone is seatless. Fabulous. Demos folks, do you need seats? Well, thank you all so much for coming. My name is Ellen. I'm the lead researcher at Chasm, which is our tech hub here at Demos, where we look at all things tech and democracy and how we can build an internet that empowers people and isn't just subject to the whims of big tech. This is why we're obviously thrilled to have James with us here today to talk about his new book. Obviously, particularly the last few years, there's been growing frustration with how big tech is kind of dictating our information spheres, our public discussions, how online work happens, how people experience socializing and leisure, and all of these different elements of the new digital normal. And at Demos, we're really excited to be trying to think about new ways that we can think about the digital world and think about how we can change the power dynamics and in a way that's much more empowering of users. So we have Kieran, who is one of our superstar researchers here in Chasm, to speak to James. Before I hand over to him, I'll just do a little bit of housekeeping. The fire exits are behind you and to your right. Back outdoor, should the alarms go off. Beverages are obviously over on my left. And if you wish to buy a copy of James's book, they are available at the back of the office. Just make your way over there and flag a Demos person at the end of the event. There'll be some time afterwards for mingling, beverages, and so forth. And lastly, huge thank you to everyone for coming, and particularly to Samaya, who is our events coordinator and has done an absolutely smashing job putting this all together. So I will hand over, without further ado, to Kieran and James. Thank you.
Cool, thank you so much, Ellen. Yes, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. It's really nice to have these in-person events again. There's so many of you. Ellen covered so much of the housekeeping that I have very little to add. Just to say we are live streaming this, but it should just capture us. So if anyone's uncomfortable, it should be all right. I'm at the University of Exeter and the head of digital research at the think tank Autonomy. And as Ellen mentioned, a lot of what we've been thinking about here at Demos, the Chasm technology team, when we look at the impacts of technology on society in the last few years, is this idea of a good web. And it really says, what kind of a web do we want? Because we've got so used, I think, to a degree for quite some time now, pointing out what's wrong with the online world, and rightly so, because there's a lot. But maybe not so good at those constructive, positive visions that we need as well. And so what I find so refreshing about James's book is one of those visions. Here is a plan, here is a positive, constructive idea about what good web would look like. And it really emphasizes democratizing that web, democratizing the digital economy. And yeah, so that's why it really resonated for me. But there's a lot to get into, so maybe James, if you want to kind of kick off with an overview of the book.
Sure. So if you want to buy the book, I also have a discount code for you to get it from the Pluto website, Muldoon 30% off. Just for you lot, just for you, and all of my Twitter followers, but it's mainly you. You're the ones that I'm really targeting with that, so you can get it online. The book is about how to reimagine a different kind of internet. The real contribution is to think at this meso level of different organizations that currently use digital platforms as their main model for selling goods and services. And what I try to do in the book is think of how we can democratize these organizations to be able to have greater control for users and for workers. So I look at things like a social media platform, I look at a public search engine, I talk about food delivery, about ride-hail apps, and in each case I draw on the thinking of a few older socialist thinkers to try and find ways that we can reimagine how digital platforms operate today. So for the theory heads out there, the kind of core of the book comes from a kind of guild socialist tradition. Thinkers like G.D.H. Cole, critics of the Fabian Party from the early 20th century. people who are interested in how to create a more participatory democratic society. It's a kind of, I guess, some people, I've learned now that there are coal heads out there, although I'm not sure I want to be in the group, because the coal heads that I met, I was like, well, okay, well, you've made me read. If you want to think about the tradition that he's part of, it's kind of left-wing critics of the Fabians, kind of early 20th century Fabian society, thinking about how forms of socialization or social ownership over economic assets, they don't have to be always state-owned. They can be owned at a variety of different levels, communities, big and small, that can have a stake in organizations, that can have a say in how they function. Now we can have the level of the state for this, but also thinking about community level, municipal level, and indeed, very importantly for digital platforms, the international level, which is one of the key aspects of the book. So in the book, I advocate for what I call as an ecosystem of alternative ownership models. We might think here of the work of the Commonwealth think tank and some of the work they did with the Labour Party during the Corbyn era. You might also think of the kind of left-wing tradition within the Labour Party, who've always been advocating for this kind of cooperative style of economy. And I try and show how that works at a kind of practical organizational level, in addition to kind of dealing with some of the theoretical questions. I think that's enough for an overview. Let's get into some more conversational stuff.
No, that's really, really good. And I resist trying to just ask loads of questions about coal, because I found it some of the most
people are into
detailed
that.
stuff.
Fine.
And I want to come to these coal head parties.
Yeah.
Well, they don't sound great, but that's a lovely overview. And I just want to add as well, I mean, one of the things that I find so refreshing about this is it feels like we're at one of these kind of inflection points in the history of the web, where it doesn't feel too grandiose to say that, where we are starting to hear another story about what the web will be, and it's all of us hanging out with Mark in the metaverse, or whatever Elon decides we're going to have. That's what we have now for Twitter. And the thing that's really unifies all those is that it's someone else saying what that story is. It's someone else deciding what that future will be. And so what I love is how comprehensive this book is. You talk, as you say, at that meta level, you look at international, you look at the kind of hyper-local element of platforms, they're really interesting there. And as you say, social media, search, the kind of e-commerce, cloud computing, the whole infrastructure of the web. So it's so comprehensive. And I think it needs to be, because we don't have a story that covers everything else right now. And that's what I love about it. But I wondered kind of across the variety, and you have so many. There's one for you that kind of really stuck out as embodying a kind of bottom-up, democratic, grassroots, participatory kind of platform socialist vision.
I could give you a concrete example. So I think it's important to say that the whole point of the book is that it does need to be a systems level approach, right? That it's not enough just to intervene in one particular model or at one level, that it's about local to international and trying to find ways to integrate that. And I also don't think that we have to be hyper-localist about this. Local isn't always better, right? There are some problems that are quite large and intractable for small organizations to deal with. The one practical example that I want to give you is actually at a kind of city level. It's a series of pilots that were EU funded over the course of about 10 years. So the first group were called Decent and the second were called Decode. And some of you might be familiar with these, but they were really centered around Barcelona, a bit in Madrid, a bit in Amsterdam, a bit in Helsinki, but led by a woman called Francesca Bria, who was the Chief Technology and Information Officer at Barcelona for quite a few years. And this is kind of coming off the back of the Squares movements, right, in the kind of early 2010s. Barcelona kind of elected this new participatory democratic platform to power, and so there was this huge wave of enthusiasm for things to be different. And on the back of this social movement, these EU projects, well, the latter one, Decode, sought to create a series of digital public infrastructure. So the kinds of services and data-driven economy that is at the base of so much of what we do in society and the economy today. practically speaking, the pilot was looking at giving citizens sensors to put around their neighborhood to measure things like noise pollution, actual pollution, some kinds of other kind of social issues that were happening in the neighborhood, and using that to feed in to the municipal council's infrastructure, and trying to create this idea of a data commons. And the idea behind this, with the kind of big picture thinking here, was about how do we replace some of the infrastructure that is currently run by private companies and get that under democratic control. So thinking about ways in which you can start to create other digital tools. You can start to create a public social media system. You can start to create free and open source software tools that will allow you to search the internet, look at maps. I instinctively say Google Maps because it's just like, it's what I do anyway. But look at maps that are to create free alternatives for people to use. I think it's understandable, but it's kind of crazy that we don't have access to the world's information in a way that doesn't go through an advertising filter, right? That we don't have like a Wikipedia for internet search engines. I mean, we have Bing, but there are others out there. There's DuckDuckGo. There's a few others. I've tried using them. They're not very good. That's the problem. And I think that's the problem with a lot of these attempts, which do try to concentrate on this extremely community-led, no money involved, people doing it volunteer. Some great stuff does come out of that space, but we also need to think seriously about scaling and about how we can get large amounts of money to fund developers and to fund people who can work in this and provide these kinds of tools. I think the great thing about this, you said give one example. So the great thing about Decode was that it was like at a European level, it was trialed in 4 different cities. Admittedly, the pilots were quite small, and I don't think the notion of a data commons, so the idea behind it, the kind of what they were aiming for was to almost create like an ecosystem of data that's collected by public devices that can then be kind of used, bought by companies under limited and strict conditions, used by data cooperatives, used by other groups to kind of create more value. I don't think we quite got there with that, right? Like that's the concept. The actuality of it was like successful collection of some data, and obviously there isn't quite the ecosystem there to have this much more thriving cooperative economy. But I think that's kind of the vision, right? That's the vision. So to inch away at the capitalist for profit organization of this space and start to eke out greater and greater sections that are publicly funded, that are cooperatively run, and that work off these different principles. And that is kind of a big part of my theory of transition, right? I think you have to be eroding the capitalist relations and trying to build up an alternative in at the same time, right? And this kind of like Eric Olin-Wright, if anyone is into that kind of theory stuff. I'm kind of persuaded a lot by his notion of transition being a combination of erosion and building something in its place. So I think, I'll
because I loved that mention and that ecological approach. Anyway, I completely agree with.
I can see you're the one that got me here. Everyone else is like, Mike, yeah.
No, but I love that example, and I love it for like the immediacy of it, right? Like you're saying, like giving people the sensors and going, okay, off you go. Like now this is your commons that you're creating, and it's it really does encapsulate it. I guess kind of as a sort of aside there, just I'm interested because a lot of what we look at Demos and a lot of what I'm very interested in as well is kind of the broader democratic change and democratic innovation that we may or maybe aren't living through. And I wondered, you talked about that example. Yes, there's some success, but maybe it doesn't come through in the way people imagined. Do you think that there is a broader question of, if we're trying to give people this opportunity to have kind of democratic control of these things, is there a bigger question of what about just the kind of how used are the people to democratic control generally in their lives? And is there a relation, do you think, between being handed that control in one place, maybe not having it in other parts of their lives?
Look, there's a really big debate in the political science literature about precisely how desired and desirable participation is. I'm a participatory Democrat, so I lean, and I think there's a lot of evidence to say that when you give people opportunities for genuine control and genuine power, they do enjoy participating. I think the evidence from like Porto Alegre and the participatory budgeting movement, a lot of the stuff that came through in the 90s and 2000s really evidences that. The classic notion in political science literature from kind of post-war onwards was that people don't want to participate. People are busy. What they want to do is get on with their lives and have a functioning representative democracy for people to kind of act in their place. Now, I think there's an element of truth to that. And I always have a lot of time for the critics of participatory democracy, particularly of those processes that aren't properly designed, that are merely consultative, that don't give people genuine power, or that just there's no connection to a kind of empowered outcome from like maybe their deliberations. So I know a lot of democratic theorists are really into like mini publics and stuff like that. I think that can really veer down a very bad path, potentially, if it's not designed well. But for me, I think, you know, and Cole, going back to your beloved Cole, it's your, how do we live in a society in which people have more control and more ownership over what they're doing and the basic conditions of their life? And that is the kind of old progressive dream, right? That is what democracy as self-government, governed by the people, was meant to be about. And there are people that have kind of created different versions of that to accommodate to the realities of modern life. But I think the really good thing about things like Decode, things like the Squares movement, is that they really try and allow democracy to live up to its own ideal of self-government and to create new avenues for people to participate in organizations that are important for them. And one of the great inspirations from Cole is that it's a project of trying to decenter the role of the state and to elevate a series of meso-level organizations for Cole producer and consumer cooperatives. But for us, and I think the way in which I relate it to what we do is, well, what about all these, you know, really important technology organizations or, you know, social media, places where, you know, you probably want to have some say over how Twitter works, right? You want to have some say over moderation policy for big sites that you visit. These are the kinds of organizations that are crying out for more democratic control. And the fact that we do have these, you know, tech bros that kind of came in off the back of publicly funded technology, right? Well, it was the US Department of Defense, but, you know, basically public money, they've, you know, this is just Mazzucato, by the way, the public money, they've come at a time when this, you know, a user-friendly consumer device was easy to develop. I mean, Zuckerberg wrote the code as like a student, right, in a few months. It's like, it's an idea whose time has come. And it shouldn't be him that takes all the profit from that, right? And it shouldn't be him who has the you know, almost like a unilateral say over the company, given his special, the status of the stock that he owns, right? It's basically a one-man show. So I think that is obviously wrong, and, you know, instituting more democratic forms of control of that is a really important way to go.
Yeah. So I think what, you know, as you're kind of getting at there, there's a huge amount of theory in the book and a huge amount of kind of theoretical underpinning. As
Background.
It's in the background.
And all you read is the beautiful prose.
You don't even notice the theory's there.
I didn't know.
It's amazing.
Barely noticed at all.
Well, in addition to the theory, what I was interested to know is, as just the author of this book, was there, and I say that because I know this is built off things you've previously researched, things you've previously written about. But was there a moment where you thought, I need to write this book, like an event or a conversation you had, or something that made you think, yes, I'm interested in these ideas, but like in the world, like this thing that's happening right now, it just is not democratic, it's not fair, it needs to change.
Well, the main problem I was having was that I wrote another book, but no one was citing or reading it. So that really got me thinking about what book people would read. But seriously, that was kind of a joke answer. Everyone's like, okay. There is another book and people don't read it, but so it's half true. But essentially my background and my history is in the history of the labour movement, history of socialism. I've done some archival work looking at the German workers' movement, particularly around the German Revolution, when it was kind of like the closest a European country has ever gotten to enacting some kind of socialization of the means of production. And so from this background, I wanted to see how we could learn from these debates and these lessons. So what organizational forms, what lessons for how to democratize various levels of organizational life, how we can bring those to the structures that we have today. So there's a lot of the kind of framework and the way of viewing the world is kind of steeped in these debates from the early 20th century. But the reason I wrote the book was because I realized that a lot of the critics that we were hearing in the mainstream media about tech were themselves usually tech insider turned critics, right? So you had Tristan Harris was probably one of the big first ones, who was on that Netflix show, The Social Dilemma. Then more recently we had Frances Haugen, and these are the people that get the most media, right? They're not sitting at Demos, right? They're at the Alan Turing Institute, or all kinds of big things going on for them. And the people that we were hearing the most in the mainstream media, I found that as the people that had caused it to begin with. And so I always found this kind of tech for good, or a more tech humanist criticism. We should turn off social media. It's like defeating our autonomy. It's finding ways to nudge us, and we just need to create slightly more ethical products. I didn't think that was reaching the fundamental problem that the tech industry really has. And so I wanted to turn to more fundamental questions in my mind of power, ownership, and control. Who owns the companies, who has control over how they operate, and in whose interest do they operate? And so they're the questions that I wanted to center here. It does draw on these older debates, and I thought write it a little bit, less Oxford University Press, more one of the trade presses, and it's worked wonders. It's worked wonders. People are reading it, which is rare for an academic, for people to.
So, I guess I'm interested to know sort of one of the things I really like, and I was joking about doing stuff like it is there was a lovely kind of story to the book. There was so much focus at the start on kind of community and going to that point that you're talking about, this sort of co-opting of set of nice ideas that these sites are creating a community for you. You talk at length about kind of Airbnb and kind of this idea that this is something that's good for us, and it's a really nicely draws out how a lot of this is complete nonsense. But what I like most of all with respect to thinking about kind of stories there is you have a story at the end of the book, and the kind of postscript to the book is a kind of speculation about a kind of dystopian future, and then maybe there's some good at the end. And you talk about this just after saying about kind of the importance of these visions and the importance of these stories, because of the more that we try to regulate these companies, the more that we try to resist them, the more we try to kind of encourage, you say, this kind of ecology of different models, the more that these companies and those who favour them are going to be resisting those efforts. And so it's in those moments when people kind of maybe on the back foot a bit about can we make change happen, that you really need these visions, you really need to feel kind of motivated, inspired. But the thing, I was kind of rereading that, the thing that really struck me was the thought that, oh God, like where do we do on Twitter, on Facebook, on Instagram, whatever it might be, where people, that's where our collective imagination often is. And I wondered, do you think that that's a concern?
Well, yeah, so I opened the book, I need to remember what the quote was. I opened the book with an Ernst Bloch quote, I believe. So the most tragic form of loss isn't the loss of security, it's the loss of the capacity to imagine that things could be different. So there's, very insightful, isn't it? So there's a real sense in the book of, we lack a coherent vision for what an alternative set of digital institutions would look like, right? When people talk about Facebook, it's always about fixing Facebook. It's always about Facebook should be this, Facebook should be that. I think we really need to think about the underlying values that we want, embodied in these kinds of organizations and the digital devices that we use. And so part of the project for the book was thinking about how big tech has so convincingly captured the idea that we can conceive of new possible futures, right? We can do anything in big tech. We can fly to the moon, we can, synthesize various types of plants and animals. The one thing we can't do is ever have any kind of democracy or democratic control over our platforms, right? We can never have a say. And I think, going back to what you alluded to, this idea that I call community washing, one of the PR tactics of tech companies to make out like they're a social enterprise, building global community, etc. I'm sure we're all familiar with that. Is that, they are always the ones in charge, right? They're always the community leaders. Brian Chesky at Airbnb called himself head of community and CEO because he thought that's how important community was, right? But notice that anytime a problem comes up, they're the ones who solve it. They're the ones who set the design problem and the design challenge, and they're the ones that come up with a solution. And so, yeah, the real issue here is thinking about first, what is that imagination going to look like? And then, as Kieran alluded to, well, how do we work that out in practice? Well, I think the starting point is organizations like Demos, like other think tanks, having a vibrant civil society where people can have space to discuss ideas, to share ideas. And the purpose of writing this book is really just to put one drop in the ocean of like one possible way in which you might want. Very important, right? And you can kind of see this as a combination of top down and bottom up, right? On the one hand, we need people who work in these organizations, people who are part of both blue collar and white collar workers within organizations like Meta and Google, to be standing up, to be organizing around both their interests and the interests of the broader public. Now, we saw a huge surge in tech worker organizing in 2019. Autonomy, the think tank I work with, works with UTOR, the tech workers union that has started last year, I think, or the year before in the UK. Perhaps there are some comrades here tonight. And that is, really amazing to see. But I think we also need to see, it can't just be kind of workers, working within the companies. I think we also need powerful organizations at the state and regulatory level to start to rein in the power of some of these tech companies, right? So I'm, am sympathetic towards, acts such as, the Digital Services Act at the EU level, because I agree with the regulators and the antitrust movement in the US that these organizations are too big. They do have too much power, and I think we do need to find ways to limit them. Both in their capacity to kind of do whatever they want, but also in terms of size and influence, right? I think we need to turn to things like the, lobbying efforts that they have, and also the very insidious ways in which they fund even the people that are criticizing them, right? You'll be hard-pressed to find a university or a private organization in Europe that is operating at a kind of big level that doesn't in some way have Google or Microsoft money, right? They fund everyone, all the soft critics that have this kind of money. I think that's a really big problem because it's a very long-term and it's a very subtle way of, shaping the debate, lifting up the voices of your soft critics, bringing them into the conversation, giving them reason to keep coming back and to stay within the professional policy network. So that, this is a big issue. But in addition to resisting and regulating big tech, the most important thing for me and, the kind of point of this book is that we also need to create alternatives, right? That it can't always just be about fixing Facebook or trying to get Zuckerberg or one of the others to do better. We need public funding for free and open source software alternatives. We need to find ways to scale those, and we need to create community. It's just really, it's a challenge, right? Because even when Musk was talking about buying Twitter and everyone's like, oh my God, I'm leaving Twitter, I'm going to Canada. There are alternatives, right? Like Mastodon is the most obvious one. It's in the Fediverse. It's like a Twitter clone, if you will. But it's very hard to be on there because no one is there. And so it's like, hello, and there's like your one techie friend's like, yeah. I have software that allows you to like cross-post, you know, and so things like that will hopefully one day bring more people over. But yeah, I think, you know, there's a lot of issues, right? Scaling, you know, funding, the problem of transitioning large global communities, you know, they're not easy to solve, right? I don't solve them in the book, so yeah, I'll leave it there.
I mean, fair enough, and you know, you provide a lot in it. So, I mean, that was kind of it from my end. I'd love to throw it out to people, again, always reminded of these things, please kind of question maybe more than a comment.
I'll accept comments.
All
I don't have
comments,
to do
all
any work,
comments.
that's great.
And maybe I'll take a couple at a time. So, does anyone have any thoughts? Yeah, yourself and then gentleman behind.
Thanks so much, James. So, I haven't read the book, so no spoilers if you want to say this. But I'm interested in knowing what you think that big tech. What's the best this can look like in an ideal scenario where there is more.
This or big tech? As in like our digital world?
Oh, as in like the companies, the cluster of companies that private sector. What is the role that private sector plays in a what I'm imagining is in your book a scenario where there is more resistance, there is more regulation, and there is more of the attempts to democratise technology writ large.
So maybe very controversially for like an out-and-out card-carrying socialist, I actually don't have a huge problem with some things being privately owned per se, right? That I'm kind of in this middle zone of a mixed economy in which there's kind of a large role both for democratic planning, for investment decisions being made by democratic collectives, but also for there to be a kind of thriving cooperative sector alongside some small and medium enterprises, some private ownership, some kinds of wage relations. The problem is when you get something like the tech sector we have today, in which the level of economic have to turn up, you know, when they get subpoenaed, they don't have to do anything. They're as large as some nation states. So I think there just needs to be limits on the capacity for these companies to grow above a certain size, perhaps above a certain user base. And there is a lot of interesting arguments from a lot of US antitrust scholars. I'm thinking of like one of the president or the CEO of Demos in the US, what's his name? Sabil Rahman, I think. Him and Zephyr Teachout, Lina Khan, I think. So these big antitrust names, really compelling arguments about the way you can limit these companies from growing above a certain size and through different types of metrics. Some of them use like total revenue, others use like market share. I think that has to be, that is basically there needs to be a ceiling basically on how powerful they can get. And I think you can do that through legislation and through democratic control, but it is part of that balance between the public and the private, and between democratic power and private power. I think that the way in which they frame it in those terms, I endorse basically.
I think you had a question.
Yeah, I was really surprised to hear you open up with GDH Cole and GDH.
You're a coalhead.
I'm bloody not. Even by GDH Cole's admission, it was pie in the sky nonsense.
No.
And GDH Cole moves to becoming a big state nationalisation man because it was a question of power. You can either ask the people that owned all these things to give up their power and they went, no, or you can go to the unions and say, will you do it for me? And they say, fine, we're going to nationalise it. And the mines and the railways were the Amazon Web Services of their day, right? And in the end, you could write 1,000 books on why it would be nice if the coal mines were more democratic, but you needed the coal miners' union to bring the state to nationalise it. And I don't really understand why you've written a book recreating this idea of like rethinking the democratic space in the way of the Guild Socialist, when like you're going to need power to do these things, and where is your power going to come from that's going to let you do it? It's not going to be, respectfully, it's not going to be a think tank. It's going to be a trade union because the owners of capital aren't going to democratise their own space.
Yeah, I think
So
I'm
why-
fully on board with you.
but why-
Have you read the book?
I haven't. But,
No,
but why not just,
we're not in
why
disagreement.
not just
sir.
nationalise it? Why not just take Amazon over? Why not just do the state?
Well,
Why do this?
Okay, no. So to start with,
Sorry for being so aggressive. I didn't mean to.
No, that's right.
Very
Some
engaged
people
with the
just
answers.
it come out that way, right? I'll start by saying I fully agree with you. There is, we could debate the finer points of Cole's of the kind of scales and different alternatives that you would need. So people talked about nationalizing Amazon, for example, during the pandemic. And one of the issues with this is, okay, let's nationalize an American company so that American politicians and lawyers are the ones who have the main say over how it operates. So it misses a crucial ingredient that Cole thought was really important, which is workplace democracy, or how do you get that kind of people within these institutions have a more of a say in how they operate. Another key point is that it misses the international development element, and it misses the kind of colonial or neo-colonial relations that a lot of these tech companies have with people in the global south, both in resource extraction and mining, but also in the way that they use populations in the global south as like data harvesting. And increasingly for companies like Meta, who have kind of exhausted their markets in the global north, is like the next frontier of desperately trying to climb to 3 billion users. And so there are other alternatives, for example, that you would want to operate at a more local or municipal level. Like, we don't want everything to be national institutions. There are lots of things that would be great if workers' cooperatives could operate. That municipal and city governments, and this new municipal movement, which I think is really promising, that tries to decentralize power. Now, the point about big tech not responding to, my book, being like, all right, here's democratic control. It's a point well taken. It's not one that I make in the book. The title of my last book, the one that flopped, was called Building Power to Change the World. And it was about the workers and union movement and how the only way to make serious change was to build institutional and organizational power. So we're fully on the same page with that point. And I'll talk to you later about Cole, because I think you're wrong about his later change. He never changes.
But let's leave that to
Let's leave that.
Alex, I saw your hand go up, but then, yeah, you in the green? Or, yeah.
I'm going to let slide the Alan Turing Institute comment. Can you talk a little bit about utility and convenience, and how we seem to default to technologies that are the easiest to use, and maybe you could even say the best, right? Like, you would choose to use Google Maps over Bing Maps because it's better, or whatever, and how perhaps that feels like a real not insurmountable, but a real challenge facing the development of alternative technologies. Is they basically, can you say they don't work as well?
Talking about with tech products where you want to reach millions of people, people don't care. They don't care if it's a socially owned alternative. When I was doing research for a food delivery platform co-op, we looked at the market, and there was about a 10% group of people that actually had any kind of care about what kind of ethical practices their company was doing, right? The biggest things were price, convenience, and the time in which the food would take to come to them. And so to operate in that space, you need to have the kind of staffing and funding to create things that just work really well. I think the greatest kind of vegan infiltration into mainstream society is often through these like fast food vegan places that don't tell anyone they're vegan. And everyone's just like chowing down on this, like, I don't know, does that exist in the UK, or is this an Australian thing? You have like Macca's but vegan? No? Anyway, well, it's like, it's everywhere in Australia. Yeah, well, you don't know, you probably are eating it. McDonald's, it's vegan. So I think the point I'm trying to make, I shouldn't have done the vegan one. The point I'm trying to make is that the products have to be funded well enough for it to work, right? For it to be on par with a kind of corporate alternative, and that's just really hard, right? That's really hard, because the private companies have millions to spend, both in R&D and in user experience. So I think that's why it can't just be a case of people doing in their spare time, of like local community groups creating tools and things. I've seen there's a group called Co-op Cycle, who are a European federation, kind of like an alternative to Deliveroo. And I've seen their software, both the courier end and the customer end, and it's very basic. It doesn't look like kind of experience that you would want to have with what many of us are used to with the food delivery companies. And yeah, I think that's an issue I'm not really sure how, aside from like more money, you would end up solving that, but it's absolutely crucial, right? Because people also don't switch platforms very easily, right? The research, I mean, it depends on the industry, but for food delivery, which is kind of what I know, it's like, 88% of customers don't switch for like a period of 2 or 3 years, right? There's very rough, and yeah, so it's all part of the challenge, I think. I'm not sure there's like a very good or easy solution.
And Green, and then Victoria.
Yeah, so it kind of goes on Alex's question to an extent, but if you don't work in a think tank, you're not an academic, then your timeline within whatever social media you use is going to be largely entertainment, humour, gossip, personal things about people you actually know, interspersed with a bit of politics, and that politics is largely going to be facile and either designed to cause outrage or to just affirm your existing beliefs. And how do you win the war for people's attention with the kind of platforms that you're describing that are going to be effectively more boring than that? There's not going to be sort of cat memes, there's not going to be, pictures of attractive members of the sex that you find attractive, there's not going to be
That's very diplomatic.
Kind of baby or whatever.
Someone who's just trashed ordinary people.
How are you going to, how are you
Not
going to get somebody to stop scrolling on Facebook for things that are either entertaining or very, very shallow in their politics, and get them to move over to turning their attention to platforms that are about how to use public funding to improve health outcomes for the children in your community? Like, how do you actually win that war for attention?
So I mean, alternative ownership doesn't necessarily mean that everyone's going to be on Duolingo learning 5 languages with their spare time, right? Like, people like what they like. It might not be to your taste, but they're probably going to do that no matter what, right? It's very hard to shift people's behavior at the deepest level that you're describing. I think we can have certain forms of justice actualize in our digital lives without necessarily shifting those kinds of consumer behaviors that you've described. Like, if take the example of like social democracy, right, writ large. Like, you can have people being idiots and living their lives and doing silly things, but they can have universal childcare, right? They can have healthcare, they can have a well-paying job, they can have a union that they can rely on. Something similar kind of applies to the digital sphere, right? Cooperatives and user-owned or user-controlled services. Then people's data isn't being harvested, right? There's not this data to advertising pipeline that's going to fund the advertising networks that are so ubiquitous in our lives. People will have a say in how some of the services that they use operate. People might have a chance to have input into the moderation policy on social media sites. So it's not going to change things like, do people like watching Love Island or Love is Blind or something like that? But it is going to have a say on very fundamental issues that are very important to people's daily lives, and that would fundamentally alter relations of power in that sphere, and I think in a very positive way.
Victoria, I think you had it.
Yeah, I was wondering, do you have any hot takes on the kind of Web3 vision, and particularly DAOs, and how using a kind of decentralized mechanism to supposedly democratize things?
So I have an article in Jacobin on that.
Nice.
My hot take is that shit. As you could imagine, I think the thing about Web3 is that it's selling you this fantasy of what Web 1, whatever that was about, right? That it was community before corporate control, that we were more free and equal and we could be ourselves, that there was free speech. Because I think, ironically, the Web3 movement overlaps quite well with a lot of the kind of Elon Musk worshipping and the crypto world and this kind of stuff. I mean, it is heavily reliant on cryptocurrency, right? Or on digital tokens. So I think there is like, it sells itself as like community control, but actually what it is a lot of the big investment funds that funded the Web 2 companies are now anteing up money for the next generation of products, because they think, particularly in things like fintech, perhaps in online gaming, although there has been a considerable pushback from gamers, that this will be the next big thing, right? Everyone is trying so hard to make Web3 happen. And I think the positive development that's happened is, well, with a huge crash in crypto, it's probably not going to be a thing, right? Because people, I think people are mostly in the Web3 space to earn a quick buck. And if that's not possible, all this rhetoric around community control and decentralization will just, blow away into the wind, because it was never about decentralization. It was about how a new generation of entrepreneurs could take the crash. That it'll just be like, oh, well, that was a silly idea.
Yeah, you've got a comment there. So yourself and then Josh.
You mentioned Mastodon, and I was wondering if there are any other particular platforms that you believe could use further investment and further attention to change, or if there are any existing platforms which could be developed in the right direction. You've got things like, for example, a much more alternative viewpoint to say what Meta has, like VR chat, as horrific as it is. Like, do you think that you can see any potential in that developing into a much more democratic and accessible way, or something like Second Life, for example, which has been around for God knows how long?
So I think of things that actually work and could work, I think basically like labor platforms and transaction platforms is the best thing we've got going and functioning at the moment. So things like, there are a few examples, like Up and Go in New York, for example, is like a domestic cleaning platform, which is like a heavily exploitative industry, mainly migrant workers, usually very informal labor market. And this is an organization that is worker run, worker controlled. They get to keep all the profits. So usually it's something like a 50-50 cut with like a platform in these kinds of like domestic care and domestic services market. 95%, I think, of the profits goes to workers. So I think these kinds of like labor platforms and also like creator platforms. So there are some alternatives to YouTube, and there are some kind of like Patreon-esque kind of sites where creators can kind of be directly funded. I think that's really cool, and I think that there are really positive developments and positive ways in which those could develop. My personal interest is for a public search engine, like a Google, but that's not advertising. And so the problem is Google, right? It's ubiquitous, and it's a big thing. But I want a Wikipedia, but for search.
So I think we'll take Josh. I think there's a kind of front, and then I think we'll wrap it up there. But yeah, Josh.
So thank you earlier for promoting Demos to an international organisation. Valuable. So a quick question on data. You've mentioned publicly funded platforms, publicly funded Google. We've heard, for example, Zoom could be used for so much else. What would you have those publicly funded platforms do with all that data, or would you not have them?
So I think there should be a serious conversation about which types of data that is collected. So the obvious example are things like data that's collected for like racial profiling with police, or most of the policing data, basically. There are certain types of data that we shouldn't collect for ethical reasons. But then I think the real benefit is that once you have a company that is for public value rather than for profit, you can start to have a conversation about how that data gets used, right? Because I don't think anyone wants to fully depersonalize digital tools. You don't want to be going on Google and then Google has no idea who you are, what you're doing, what search results you're looking for. What you should be able to have is a simple interface in which you as the user can control the type of search tool that you're using. You just click a button and it's like, okay, collecting personal data to optimize your search. But the whole point is there's no incentive for the company to start tracking you off the website, to start harvesting data, because it's all about consumer insight, right? They don't care about who you are as an individual or what your personal hobbies are. It's the demographic information that they care about, right? They want to start, making commercial value out of the data in its aggregate. Like, they need millions of data points to be able to sell an advertising product to a third party. So I think when you get rid of that advertising product to a third party, so I think when you get rid of that, suddenly, like, all kinds of questions open up, right? Well, we can use mobility data to improve public transport. We can use health data to improve the way our health services operate. That's the real, like, the thing about socialism is, like, a lot of the time you're spent talking about really boring questions of ownership and, like, governance. But the exciting stuff is what would come or what would flow from that. How do we live happier and more fulfilling lives? How do we have services that protect people, that care for people, that, you know, allow people to be the best versions of themselves because they're properly supported by a bunch of social democracy infrastructure. So I think that's the kind of cool stuff. And I also, just to add one more thing while I'm on this little rant, is I think a lot of people genuinely do want to, like, make the world. Be with the smartest people and you'll get to change the world. The problem is what they're actually doing is they're helping to optimize advertising products, right? Most of the energy goes into thinking, how do we increase, how do we increase the bottom line? How do we maximize user engagement? What can we do on this app to make people more addicted to it? How do we get notifications coming on their front screen? How do we, all that kind of stuff. What if people actually got to work on serious problems, right? That got to work on creating digital tools that actually helped people, that solved, issues, common social issues that we have. I think that would be the exciting thing, and that's what I hope, this kind of cooperative data ecosystem would be about.
So yeah, take your question, Mark.
Yeah. Mine was like it was sort of related to the Web3 stuff, but I can sort of expand it a little bit. Because I agree with you, like the Web3 stuff is like all kind of nonsense. But one of the interesting things, at least at the beginning of it, was this, I think, this capacity for people to at least kind of try believe in a different idea of what the internet could be. And I think that's like a really useful indicator. And I guess like my question is like, how do you sort of develop language to kind of facilitate the idea that the internet should be or could be used differently? Because I think that like for people who work in like this type of space or like in tech, like that's kind of a given that it can be lots of things and it should be lots of things. But like when you're talking to, I can only really speak anecdotally, but when you speak to like ordinary people, they can kind of say, they'll kind of say things like platforms should be better, or they should be like better regulated, or things could be more efficient, but like conversations don't really go beyond that. And I think I was like just interested in how you think we should be developing a language to facilitate some of the arguments that you make in your book. And I guess even if that's possible, or could there sort of be a contradictory element to that in which what you end up doing is basically the argument that the most radical argument you end up advancing is we should be able to rebuild platforms rather than really think about whether platforms are necessarily the best way of organizing how the internet actually functions. Does that make sense?
Yeah, a lot of sense. I agree with you. I think that the exciting thing about Web3 was that it started this genuine conversation about maybe we're at a crossroads, right? Maybe Facebook is now Meta. The user base has started to decline for the first time in their entire history. A bunch of new kind of competitors are on the field. Maybe we could. I'm not a comms guy though. I'm a theory guy. So I as many people have pointed out, if I was a comms guy, I wouldn't have called my book Platform Socialism. the brand is not doing well. We've got Jeremy Corbyn out there trashing the brand, and all of his comms team useless. And like, yeah, I don't really have an answer for you. I'm not sure how you would make it more relatable for the kids to. Berkheim would be involved, that's all I know. That's the only part of the equation I know works in my mind.
It was a challenge. Well, we're going to wrap it up there. Please do stick around. I was going to say we have the space till 8, it's ours, so but please do leave by 8. And yeah, have a chat, have a drink, and as I said at the start, there's copies of James's book available at a discount.
Muldoon 30 from the Pluto website. Don't be sleeping on that.
But yeah, I just want to say thank you again all for turning up, and I think just a round of applause for James.